Something shifted inside the Republican Party this week. Not gradually, not subtly but with the kind of blunt, unmistakable force that only one man in American politics can still generate. And if you were watching closely, if you were paying attention to the language being used, the timing of the statements, and the reaction from Capitol Hill, you would understand that what happened in the last 72 hours is not a routine political spat. This is a defining moment for a party that is, by almost every serious measure, at war with itself and the men who built that war, who fueled it, who in many ways is the war, has now issued something that political analysts inside Washington are describing in private as an ultimatum. Donald Trump, the 47th President of the United States, delivered what can only be described as a blunt and pointed warning to members of his own party. Not to Democrats. Not to the media. To Republicans. To the men and women who sit in Congress under the banner of a party that he has, for a decade now, reshaped in his own image. The message was clear: fall in line, or face the consequences. And in Trump's political universe, those consequences are real. They are documented. They are historical. And they are coming. If you're trying to understand why this moment matters, why this isn't just another news cycle, another Twitter flare-up, another Washington drama that fades by Friday, you need to understand something about the structural position Donald Trump occupies within the modern Republican Party. He is not simply its leader in the ceremonial sense. He is, in the most operationally accurate description available, its gatekeeper. Its enforcer. Its single most decisive electoral asset and its single most destabilizing internal force. Both things are true simultaneously. And right now, both of those forces are being applied at full pressure against members of his own caucus. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to go back not just weeks but months. Because what exploded into public view this week was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of a slow-building internal crisis that Republican strategists, congressional staffers, and party donors have been watching with increasing anxiety since the beginning of this year. The fault lines were always there. They just finally broke open. Earlier this year, as Trump entered his second term with a wave of executive ambition moving faster and more aggressively than in his first term a quiet but significant group of Republican senators and House members began expressing, mostly in private, reservations about the pace and scope of the agenda being pushed from the White House. These were not never-Trumpers. They were not holdovers from the old establishment who never accepted the MAGA transformation of the party. Many of them had voted for Trump twice, had campaigned alongside him, had stood at his rallies. But on specific policy questions on the budget, on foreign commitments, on certain executive actions they began to signal, carefully and quietly, that they had limits. In Washington, those signals rarely stay quiet for long. By last month, reporting from multiple outlets had begun to surface the contours of what insiders were calling a soft resistance a loose, informal grouping of Republican members who were, at minimum, not fully committed to rubber-stamping every element of the White House legislative agenda. The numbers were not large. In the Senate, you were talking perhaps 6 to 10 members who had, at various points, expressed private doubts. In the House, where the Republican majority is thin enough that a handful of defections can sink any bill, the calculation was even more precarious. Leadership knew it. The White House knew it. And Trump knew it. What changed this week what turned a simmering internal tension into an open confrontation was a specific legislative moment combined with a set of public comments from several Republican members that crossed a line the White House was apparently unwilling to let pass without a direct response. The details matter here. Last week, a spending and budget package that the White House had pushed aggressively framing it as central to the fiscal agenda Trump had promised during the campaign ran into unexpected turbulence on Capitol Hill. The turbulence was not from Democrats, who were in unified opposition anyway. It came from Republicans. A small number of senators raised procedural objections. Several House members indicated they could not support the bill in its current form. For a day and a half, the legislative math simply did not work, and everyone in Washington knew why. And then Trump moved. What followed was not a diplomatic phone call. It was not a quiet lunch at the White House, the kind of traditional presidential arm-twisting that has characterized congressional relations for generations. What Trump delivered was public, pointed, and deliberately humiliating for those it targeted. He took to his social media platform and, in a series of posts that read more like warnings than political commentary, made clear that Republicans who were not with him on this agenda would face challenges in their primaries. He used language that left very little room for interpretation. He named no names publicly, but sources with direct knowledge of the conversations confirmed that private communications were far more explicit. And then, in a broader statement that has since circulated widely, Trump made an argument that cuts to the very heart of what the Republican Party is and what it is becoming. He said, in essence, that the era of Republicans who want the benefits of the MAGA coalition without the commitments that coalition demands is over. That the party's future, its electoral viability, its identity, its very survival as a governing force, depends on unity. His kind of unity. On his terms. Here's what most people are missing in the initial coverage of these statements. The surface-level story is Trump versus a few Republican holdouts on a spending bill. That is the tactical layer. But the strategic layer is something far more significant. What Trump is doing, and what his political operation has been building toward for months, is the consolidation of a loyalty architecture within the Republican Party that is unlike anything American political history has seen in the modern era. In previous administrations, even in the first Trump term, there was at least a theoretical space within the Republican Party for dissent. It was costly. It was often career-ending, as figures like Liz Cheney could attest. But it was possible. Senators like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Mitt Romney, before his retirement, could vote against the president on specific issues and survive, at least in the short term. The party had enough breadth, enough regional variation, enough institutional memory of operating as something other than a presidential vehicle, that there were multiple centers of gravity. What Trump is now signaling, in this warning to his own party, is that the consolidation he has been executing over the past several years is complete enough that those alternative centers of gravity no longer have sufficient mass to resist. He is telling Republicans that the old model, where you could be a moderate Republican from a swing state, calibrate your votes to your local constituency, and maintain a working relationship with a Republican White House, is functionally dead. The price of Republican identity is now full alignment. And those who cannot pay that price need to understand what happens next. To appreciate the credibility of that threat, you have to look at the record. Because Trump's track record in Republican primaries is, whatever you think of the politics, operationally formidable. In the 2022 cycle, he targeted a specific set of Republicans who had crossed him, members who had voted for impeachment, members who had publicly criticized him, and while the results were mixed, the overall pattern was instructive. Several of his targets were indeed defeated. Others survived, but only after brutal primary challenges that consumed enormous resources and left them weakened heading into general elections. The message was received across the caucus: the cost of defiance is real, and it is enforced. By 2024, the consolidation had gone further. The Republican presidential primary, which at one point featured more than a dozen candidates, collapsed in a historically short period of time. Figures who had explicitly positioned themselves as alternatives to Trump, as the post-Trump future of the party, found themselves without a viable constituency. The donors who had once funded establishment candidates quietly redirected their money. The grassroots infrastructure that might have sustained a challenge simply was not there. And when the dust settled, Trump not only won the nomination but did so with a level of party unity that contradicted almost every prediction made 2 years earlier. That history is the backdrop against which this week's warning must be understood. When Trump says the party's future is at stake, he is not engaging in rhetorical excess for the cameras. He is making a structural argument that has been validated by years of evidence. And Republican members of Congress know it. Now, let's talk about what the Republicans on the other side of this confrontation are actually thinking, because their position is more complicated, and more strategically constrained, than it might appear from the outside. The members who have been hesitating on the White House's legislative agenda are not, by and large, ideologically opposed to Trump's core program. They are not secret liberals. They are not planning to caucus with Democrats or launch some kind of centrist insurgency. What they are doing is something that all legislators, regardless of party, do at some level: they are managing their own electoral survival in the context of their specific constituencies. And for a handful of senators from states where the political terrain is genuinely competitive, where a Republican cannot simply run as a Trump maximalist and expect to win, the calculus is more complex than pure loyalty to the White House agenda. The problem is that this kind of calculation, however rational it might seem from the perspective of individual political survival, is no longer tolerated within the architecture Trump has built. The MAGA coalition does not run on the logic of regional variation. It runs on the logic of national movement. And movements, by their nature, demand coherence. They demand that members subordinate local considerations to the larger cause. That is the demand being made now, explicitly, and the members who received this warning understand that they are being asked to choose between their immediate political instincts and their long-term viability within the party structure. This is not a comfortable position. And several of them, according to reporting from sources close to the congressional leadership, have spent the past 48 hours in urgent conversations with their chiefs of staff, with their political consultants, with their fundraisers trying to figure out what their options actually are. The honest answer, based on the structural realities of the current Republican Party, is that the options are very limited. What makes this moment particularly significant and this is the part that serious political analysts are focusing on is the timing. Trump is in the early portion of his second term. Historically, presidents use the first year of a second term to push the most ambitious elements of their agenda, knowing that midterm politics will eventually complicate the legislative math. The window is not unlimited. And Trump's political operation is clearly aware of this. The urgency of the warning, the public nature of it, the explicit framing around party survival all of this suggests a White House that is determined to extract maximum legislative output from this window before the political environment potentially shifts. There is also a domestic political dimension here that goes beyond the immediate legislative fight. Trump's approval ratings, while substantial within the Republican coalition, face the same structural headwinds that second-term presidents historically confront. The economy is producing signals that are, at minimum, mixed. Inflation concerns have not entirely dissipated. Certain international commitments are generating debate within the party's own foreign policy circles. And the administration is managing a set of ongoing legal and political controversies that, while they may not threaten Trump's position within his base, do consume political bandwidth and create distractions from the legislative agenda. In this context, a Republican caucus that is fully unified and reliably delivers legislative wins is not merely politically desirable. It is operationally essential. A divided caucus one that produces visible, public splits on major legislation creates a narrative of governing dysfunction that opposition parties exploit ruthlessly. Democrats, who are currently in the minority in both chambers and searching for a way back to relevance, would welcome nothing more than footage of Republican infighting to run in the 2026 midterm cycle. Trump knows this. His political operation knows this. And the warning to Republicans is, in part, a preemptive move to shut that narrative down before it has a chance to develop. Now let's look at the geopolitical and strategic backdrop, because this internal Republican confrontation does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs at a moment when the United States is managing an unusually complex set of international relationships, and the signals that come out of Washington about the coherence and direction of American political leadership are read carefully by governments around the world. Allies in Europe, who have been navigating a more transactional relationship with Washington under this administration, are watching the internal Republican dynamics with attention. A Trump administration that is legislatively strong, that can deliver on its domestic agenda, and that projects internal political coherence is a fundamentally different interlocutor than an administration that appears weakened by party conflict. European chancelleries understand that the credibility of American commitments whether on trade, on security, on multilateral institutions depends in part on the domestic political strength of the administration making those commitments. In Beijing, the analysts who watch American politics professionally are doing their own reading of this moment. China's strategic calculus with respect to the United States has always incorporated an assessment of American internal political coherence. A Republican Party that is visibly fractured, that cannot deliver its own legislative agenda, is a different kind of adversary than a unified one. That is not to say that Chinese policymakers are rooting for either outcome they are making strategic calculations regardless but the signal value of American political dysfunction is real and it is noticed. In the Middle East, where the Trump administration has been actively engaged on multiple fronts, the perception of Washington's political strength matters enormously. Governments in the region have calibrated their relationship with the United States based in part on their assessment of Trump's domestic political position. A Trump who is fighting with his own party is a different interlocutor than a Trump who commands complete Republican unity. This calculus runs through every bilateral relationship the administration is managing. If you're trying to understand why this matters beyond the borders of the United States, the answer is this: in a world where American leadership is already contested, where the question of whether Washington can sustain consistent, coherent foreign policy commitments is genuinely uncertain, the internal politics of the Republican Party have direct implications for how that leadership is perceived and whether it can be relied upon. This is not a purely domestic story. It never is, when we are talking about the internal workings of the world's most consequential political party. Let's now examine the historical parallels, because serious political analysis requires placing current events within the longer arc of American political history. What Trump is doing attempting to enforce loyalty through a combination of public pressure, primary threats, and the projection of political dominance has precedence. But the scale and the completeness of the effort are historically unusual. Lyndon Johnson was famously effective at using a combination of persuasion, intimidation, and legislative maneuvering to hold his congressional coalition together. But Johnson operated within a Democratic Party that was structurally diverse, that contained genuine ideological variation from conservative Southern Democrats to Northern liberals, and his methods, however effective, were always operating against significant centrifugal forces. Ronald Reagan, who is often cited as the last Republican president who truly reshaped the party in his image, did so through an ideological project that created a new philosophical consensus supply-side economics, anti-communism, social conservatism that gave Republicans a shared intellectual framework. Trump's project is different. It is less about shared ideology than about shared loyalty. Less about a policy program that members believe in and more about a political identity that they have staked their careers on. The historical parallel that some analysts find most instructive is not Reagan but rather the machine politics of an earlier era the party bosses of the late 19th and early 20th centuries who maintained control through a combination of patronage, threat, and the monopoly of organizational resources. Trump's version of this is modernized it runs through social media rather than smoke-filled rooms, through grassroots mobilization rather than ward captains but the underlying structure is recognizable. The leader controls access to the coalition, and access to the coalition is the prerequisite for electoral survival. That is the leverage being applied right now. The question that historians will eventually ask and that political scientists are already asking is whether this kind of loyalty architecture is durable. Historical machine politics eventually ran into limits, reform movements, changing demographics, the rise of alternative organizational structures that could contest the machine's monopoly on political resources. Trump's political machine faces its own version of these limits, and understanding them is essential to understanding where this confrontation ultimately leads. There is a generational dimension to this. The Republican members who are most resistant to complete alignment with the Trump agenda tend to be those who came up in a party that operated differently who learned politics in an environment where individual members maintained more autonomy, where ideological heterodoxy was tolerated within reasonable bounds, where the senator from a competitive state could genuinely represent the specific interests and temperament of that state's electorate rather than functioning as a vote delivery mechanism for a national movement. These members are not wrong that this older model of Republican politics existed. They are discovering, in real time, that it no longer does. The younger generation of Republican politicians the members elected in 2020 and 2022 and 2024 who came into politics during or after the MAGA transformation operate with a fundamentally different set of baseline assumptions. For them, the Trump-era Republican Party is not a change from the party they entered. It is the only party they have ever known professionally. They have no institutional memory of operating differently, and they have no particular nostalgia for the old model. This generational divide within the Republican caucus is one of the underappreciated structural factors shaping this week's confrontation. Now let's turn to the scenarios. Because the most important question the one that viewers watching this situation unfold need to think carefully about is not what happened this week but what happens next. The first and most straightforward scenario is the one the White House is clearly working toward: rapid capitulation by the holdouts, followed by legislative unity on the budget package, followed by a public narrative of Republican cohesion that strengthens Trump's hand going into the next phase of the agenda. This scenario has a significant probability. The structural incentives pushing Republican members toward compliance are substantial. The threat of primary challenges is credible. The alternative defying the president publicly, becoming a target of his political operation, and trying to survive in a Republican primary against a challenger who has the backing of the MAGA machine is genuinely frightening for most members. History suggests that when Trump applies this kind of pressure, the most common outcome is some form of accommodation. Members find a way to support the White House position. Sometimes they extract minor concessions to give themselves political cover. But they get to yes. If this scenario plays out, the short-term consequences are a legislative win for the White House, a reinforcement of Trump's political dominance within the party, and a deepening of the loyalty architecture that this warning was designed to enforce. The longer-term consequences are more complex. Every time this dynamic plays out every time members comply under pressure rather than from genuine conviction the internal cohesion of the caucus becomes slightly more brittle. Compliance under threat is not the same as unity. And a caucus that is compliant but not genuinely unified is more vulnerable to fracture under conditions of real political stress an economic shock, an international crisis, a significant reversal of political fortune. The second scenario involves partial accommodation with meaningful concessions. In this version, the holdout members do not fully capitulate, but they do not fully hold out either. Back-channel negotiations produce modifications to the policy in question modifications significant enough that the members can characterize their support as substantive rather than purely submissive. The bill passes, the White House claims a victory, and the members who held out can tell their constituencies that they extracted real changes in exchange for their votes. This is a time-honored mechanism of congressional politics, and it is not without precedent in the current era. The risk from the White House perspective is that visible negotiation with holdouts signals that pressure campaigns can be successfully resisted at the margins, which potentially invites more resistance in the future. This is why the White House has been so publicly aggressive they want compliance, not negotiation. The third scenario is the most consequential and the least immediately likely, but the one that analysts with a longer time horizon take seriously. In this scenario, enough Republican members particularly in the Senate decide that the cost of permanent subordination to the White House is higher than the cost of becoming targets of the Trump political operation. They hold their ground. The legislation fails or is substantially modified. A visible crack appears in Republican unity. And the internal fault line that has been developing all year breaks into open view. This scenario becomes more probable under specific conditions, if the policy being demanded is genuinely toxic to the home state constituencies of several senators simultaneously, if the primary threat begins to seem less credible because of a shift in the broader political environment, or if a critical mass of members concludes that the precedent being set of complete subordination to presidential authority on all legislative questions is more dangerous to their long-term institutional position than the short-term cost of resistance. None of these conditions are currently dominant. But they are not impossible. And in politics, as in physics, pressure that cannot find release tends to find it in unexpected ways. The fourth scenario the most structurally interesting and the most historically significant if it were to occur involves the emergence of what some political scientists have been calling a quiet institutionalist coalition within the Republican Senate. This is not a never-Trump formation. It is not a return to the old establishment. It is something more subtle, a group of Republican senators who are, individually, unwilling to break with Trump publicly, but who collectively and quietly begin to exercise a form of senatorial prerogative that limits the White House's ability to dictate legislative outcomes. They do not defy Trump. They negotiate with him. They maintain forms rather than substance. They give him wins on the issues where he cares most about optics and hold the line on the issues where they have genuine convictions. This is, in some ways, the model that certain senators have already been attempting to execute. Whether it is sustainable as a long-term strategy whether the White House will continue to tolerate it is one of the defining questions of this political moment. There is a fifth dimension to consider, and it connects the internal Republican confrontation to the broader question of American democratic governance. The warning Trump delivered this week is not just about a spending bill. It is about the model of executive-legislative relations that this administration is attempting to establish as normal. The assertion that a president can and should use the full weight of his political operation his fundraising network, his grassroots base, his social media reach, his ability to elevate or destroy political careers to enforce compliance from members of his own party in Congress is not a neutral claim about how American government should work. It is a specific and contested vision of presidential power. And the members of the Republican Party who are most uncomfortable with this week's warning are, at some level, uncomfortable not just with the specific demands being made but with the model of governance those demands represent. The founders of the American Republic were explicitly worried about this kind of dynamic. The separation of powers, the independence of the legislature, the design of the Senate in particular as a body capable of resisting executive pressure. These were not accidental features of the constitutional architecture. They were intentional responses to the danger of executive dominance. The question of whether those structural protections are sufficient to resist the kind of political pressure Trump is applying, pressure that operates not through formal institutional channels but through the informal machinery of democratic politics, is one of the most serious questions in contemporary American political science. It does not have an obvious answer. And it will not be resolved this week. What we can say with confidence is this: the warning Trump delivered to Republicans this week marks a threshold moment in the ongoing transformation of the American political party system. It is not the beginning of this transformation. That began long before this week, arguably a decade ago, arguably longer. But it is a crystallizing moment, a moment in which the new rules of Republican politics are being stated explicitly, without apology, and with the full weight of the president's political authority behind them. The members of Congress who received this warning are making calculations right now. Some of them have already made their decisions. Others are still working through the math. They are weighing primary vulnerability against governing conviction. They are weighing short-term compliance against long-term institutional prerogative. They are weighing their relationship with their state constituencies against their relationship with a national party structure that increasingly demands alignment with a national movement. And here is the final thing worth sitting with, the thing that separates serious analysis of this moment from the noise that surrounds it. Whatever individual members decide in the coming days, the underlying tension that produced this confrontation does not go away. It persists. A Republican Party that is held together by the political dominance of one man, rather than by a durable and broadly shared governing philosophy, is a party that is structurally dependent on that man's continued dominance. The moment that dominance weakens, through electoral reversal, through a shift in the political environment, through the natural entropy that eventually catches up with every political era, the coalition will face a reckoning of its own. The question of what the Republican Party is, what it believes, and who it serves, is a question that has been deferred rather than answered by the MAGA consolidation. It will eventually demand an answer. For now, Trump has issued his warning. The party is listening. And the decisions being made in the next few days, in private conversations in Senate offices, in phone calls between members and their political teams, in the quiet calculus of people who have staked their careers on navigating this impossible terrain, will tell us something important about whether the architecture of loyalty that has been built over the past decade is as solid as it appears, or whether the first visible cracks are beginning to form. Watch this space. Because what happens next inside the Republican Party will not stay inside the Republican Party. The consequences will move outward, into legislation, into foreign policy, into the broader question of what American governance looks like in the years ahead. The stakes, as this week has made undeniably clear, are not small. They are not procedural. They are not the ordinary friction of legislative politics. They are something larger and more consequential. And whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, or someone who has never cast a vote in your life, what happens next matters to you. That is the unavoidable reality of this moment. And it is the reason this story is worth watching with the seriousness it demands.